I'd now like to look at what I'm calling translation solution types, which is just all the little tricks, all the things that translators can do, and I try to arrange them into some memorizable or memorable order. To follow this lecture, first you should try to translate these examples into your favorite language other than English. So what you can do is stop the lecture right now and get out a piece of paper or on your computer and just write quick translations for these 7 items here. I know you won't do it, but just in case, stop it and do it, okay? If not, let's go on with the lecture. Let's go back to where we were some weeks ago before we looked at all the technology. We had to translate this sentence, the ink is on the table. And I said there were basically 2 ways of translating it. We could do it linguistically, item for item, as machine translation would do it. Or we could look at it in context, for example, with that particular picture, that gives you a situation, and we could translate for the functions. So we had these possible translations. And that's a very simple typology of what translators do. And the logic is either or. This is a very strong binarism, typical of Western thought on translation. It goes back at least to Cicero, the Roman orator, who said you can translate like an orator, like giving a political speech, a function, or you can translate like an interpreter in a business negotiation, getting the prices right, for example. One or the other. And you can just see here in this list that fundamentally binary way of thinking, this side or the other side, has been very strong. Um, Perhaps obviously because in translation you usually have 2 languages, 2 sides, and 2 people to deal between. But there's no strong reason why your mental process should be dictated to by that geometrical binarism, one side or the other. Anyway, Schleiermacher, certainly in German at the beginning of the 19th century, distinguished between what we now call domesticating. For him, that was verdeutschende, the making German of the foreign text, and foreignizing, verfremdende Übersetzung for Schleiermacher. And that has been very strong. The Bible translator and theorist Eugene Neider distinguished between formal correspondence and dynamic equivalence. So we're going to look at that in a moment. And you might have heard of some of these others that I'm not going to go into now, but I just indicate the strength of that either or thinking about translation. I really think that life is more complicated than that. But here's to give you an idea of what Eugene Neider, I mentioned the Bible translator and theorist of Bible translator, um, saw as being your options. One was called equivalence, and equivalence for Neider is to give you the same value, but using different means. Okay, so equivalence for Neider was dynamic equivalence. In Latin, we have the term the Agnus Dei, which is rendered as the Lamb of God, which Eskimos or Inuits might render as the seal of God. The seal is the animal that they are familiar with. Actually, that's an example Neider did not use, and I should stop referring to it. But it's an extreme case of what dynamic equivalence would look like. He does, I think, talk about um, biblical characters meeting each other and giving a holy kiss in the traditional biblical text. And he says, well, you know, for contemporary Americans, this men kissing men, it doesn't look too good. And so he translates that or recommends that it be translated as a hearty handshake all round. That would be a better example of dynamic equivalence. The place where Jesus was born, some of us call Bethlehem. Bethlehem in Arabic and in Hebrew means house of bread. Are we going to translate it as house of bread? That would translate its dynamic meaning. Or are we going to do a literalism? Just borrow the word, borrow the name, which is what we usually do. We call it Bethlehem without knowing why or what the name means. So for Nida, he's not a simple thinker, he never was, but to get his message across, he had one or the other. You go formal for the form of the text, or you go dynamic to achieve the function. Now, many people have dealt with this problem, and so I want to look at a few traditions. And one of the main problems when you do this is that the same words have meant very different things. For example, and this is the main example, the term equivalence, which you just saw in NIDA, attached to functional, dynamic changing of the text, in a Russian tradition, which goes back to the 1930s, is used for the opposite. So if we go back here to 1934, we see that equivalence, or its Russian term, is used for when the text does not change. And that's opposed to substitution, which is when you replace things in the text. Okay, and that continued through in the Russian tradition for a long time. And many people think that equivalence does mean that. Equivalence means word for word close to the text. Not necessarily. Here, it meant the opposite. Okay, and as you can see in this Russian tradition, what happened over the years is that that category substitution, which would be the domesticating side of business, if you like, grew. We get more and more tricks of the trade, more and more things that translators do, not on the strict close to the text type of translating, but on the other. And that's the tradition that really interests me, that those long lists of things that effectively break with the binary distinction between one or the other. So in that Russian tradition, Retska there is seeing equivalence as something that doesn't change over time, very fixed, okay? What we would these days call terminology, in fact. That equivalence for him was that very formally fixed type of thing, whereas the substitution was in order to adapt to new context and new situations. What happened is that in the 1970s, the Russian theorists changed the meaning of equivalence and adopted the Western sense of equivalence, meaning to adapt to new situations or to functions. So this is not a lecture on equivalence. I'm just warning you, if you're reading any translation theory out there, the meaning of that term has changed radically over time. Retska, example of equivalence, a mobile phone in the United States is a cell phone in Australia and in Britain, I think. In German, it's ein Handy, which I love as a neologism, ein Handy, and there's your Chinese as well, okay? Fixed terms, equivalence in that old sense. But if you think about it, the handy is a very creative kind of equivalent. You know, they've thought about it and adapted to a different view of the function. In the Western tradition, the most important work was by these two people, Vinet and D'Arbonnet, published in French in 1958. These were two French linguists in Canada. And for them, the term equivalence, or equivalence, as they had it, was quite specifically for corresponding idioms, for changing the text quite radically. So, you know the expression in English, like a bull in a china shop. China here means porcelain, plates, like a bull comes in and breaks everything. So you come in and you're very robust and perhaps violent, okay? In French, it's like a dog in a game of skittles, comme un chien dans un jeu de quilles. So the bull in the china shop corresponds to the dog in the game of skittles, and that for Vinet and D'Arbonnet back in 58, that was equivalence, that was equivalence. The exact opposite from what was happening in Russian in the same period. Okay, there's your Chinese. Another example, give him an inch, he'll take a mile. In Chinese, that comes out, get inch, take foot, which is pretty close. I think in Spanish, it's if you give a I don't know, give a hand, they'll take your arm, something like that. Okay, all right, but the idea exists in many languages and many cultures, and you can line them up and translate on that very functional level. That is the sense of equivalence for Vinay and Dabelne. That was 58, though. If you go on a bit, you get work by John Catford, 1965, and he's using the same term in a more interesting way. He says you can be equivalent to different things at different levels in the text, right? You can be equivalent at word level, phrase level, sentence level. You can be equivalent to the phonemes. You can be equivalent to the macro function. And he says that translators, when they go, they are creating equivalence, creating it on different levels. Equivalences shunt up and down the rank scale. I love that expression. Because we have these different levels of language, of linguistic work. And so for him, it's a very creative, very non-fixed thing. And the translator decides at what level equivalence is going to be used. Now, this is where the tradition grows. Once you have that idea that translators can do more than just one or the other, you get these typologies that are rather interesting. This guy is Lo Yang, as he signed the book published in Beijing in 1958, the same year as the French one in Canada. And interestingly, going into Chinese, he's got lots and lots of ways of rendering foreign terms, okay? Basically because Chinese has a different script. It's got the characters, so that gives more options. And then he's got lots of different ways for preserving naturalness. And you're getting, you can see the binarism there. You've got, that set of things you can do and that set of things you can do. But there are lots and lots of things you can do there. And that's what interests me. That's what I think is most useful for translators. Now, Lo was working in the 50s in China from the Russian tradition that we just saw. We saw in Russian this list was growing. He goes across to Chinese, and in this area, it grows even more. In the meantime, if you go back to that French tradition I was talking about, I've mentioned here, you've got equivalence down here at number, right down the bottom there, okay? What Vinay and Dabelne are doing is going from a midterm, which is literal translation, and that's where you get the ink is on the table, okay? And they recognize two directions that you can head in from there, from that sort of 0 degree replacement exercise. You can go towards the ST, borrowing structures, they call them calques, or bringing in loan words. These are the sorts of things that Lo was talking about on the left there. Or you can go down towards the target culture using transpositions, all sorts of things that I'm not going to go into in great detail, right through to the level of adaptation at the bottom, where, for example, what is it? Riding a bike in France corresponds to cricket. In Britain corresponds to baseball in the United States. Why? They're all summer sports. Okay, so you get that radical level of what we would call these days cultural translation at the bottom there. So it's a wide range. The binarism has all but disappeared. It's still there because there are two directions you can go in, and they do call this one direct and this one oblique, which are peculiar terms to use. But this is more useful for translators, I think, because we can see the options that are available to us. True, this schema works well between cognate languages. It was written for French and English. When we're translating between non-cognate languages, for example, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, our solutions tend to be starting at this level of transposition or substitution, but there are still the two directions that you can go in. If we compare the two, Vinay Double in 1958 with LOTE 58, we see that logically Chinese has more things you can do on the level of borrowing, although there's significant correspondence on all the other levels, bearing in mind that they did this independently. Vinay and Doubleday were working from Swiss stylistics, Charles Bally, and this was coming through translations of Fedorov from Russian. People don't give up. This is used, for example, Vinay and Doubleday's categories, even though they were written for French and English, are used in a textbook for English and Japanese, even though Japanese is syntactically a radically different language. And the categories are reproduced there as being things people can do, but the author here adds categories for omission and addition, that is changing the text, and text organization, and particularly politeness with work into Japanese becomes a category on a level that it never was in work between French and English. We've done some work on these different typologies, and it's very clear to me, I've done this in class with students from different backgrounds. If I give people the typology by law, the Chinese students will prefer that one. And if I give them Vinay Doubleday, the French-English one, the Romance language students will prefer that one. So there's sort of national preferences there. What we do find, though, is that most people can't remember what the names mean. For example, the transposition and modulation, they're terms actually taken from musical theory, music theory. People sort of, what does that one mean? What does that one mean? And the terms are rather hard to understand. And the notion of adaptation also proves quite difficult. Chinese students, I find when we do this, tend to think that a literal translation, what they mean, the ink is on the table type translation, is a faithful translation. But, for somebody like Nida, faith can be on any level of the text. Okay, and and I get a lot of students saying, oh, there are really just two ways to translate, the literal and the free. But hey, there's a lot of freedom around. If there's literal, that's one thing, but there's a lot of different things you can do when you're free, and it's good to know about them. All right, so I spent some time looking at all those different typologies and the tradition, so you don't have to, saving you a lot of work. And I've tried to come up with a typology that I think will work for quite a few languages. I'm not going to say it's universal. Far from it, but it sort of may be helpful to translators. And in the next few minutes, I want to go through these categories. The basic thought is this. One, when you're translating in cruise mode, you're using your language skills, you're imagining situations, you don't have to stop and really think about how to solve a problem. That's cruise mode. You do that fine. Great. This is not for you. I am looking at solutions that are needed when you have big, fat, juicy problems in front of you. I am not trying to describe everything that goes on in the translator's brain. This is not a piece of cognitive linguistics, for example. No, this is pedagogy. I'm trying to tell people ways in which problems can be solved. And I'm saying there are three things you can do when you have a big, juicy translation problem. One, copy what's in the ST. Okay, copy. Just copy. You can copy words, copy structure. Right? Two, if that doesn't work, change the expression. And three, if that doesn't work, change the text. That is, change the material in the text. What I've got down here, text tailoring. Cut things out, put things in on the level of sentences, of paragraphs, big things, okay? So what do we have to remember? This material change to text tailoring means big things, changing the ST, like pre-editing, change the ST. Copying just means bringing things across from the ST. And the really interesting one for us, I think, is this category of expression change, when I've got a list of things that people can do. So those are the three there. These are the ones we're going to look at in more detail. And underneath all of these categories, there's a whole lot of different things that people can do in different situations. And these lists have 3 dots. That means they can go on and on and on. Translators do many wonderful things. They have lots and lots of tricks. The important thing is that cruise mode means you're doing things that are quite complex, but no special solutions are necessary. Remember that. Cruise mode, that's out of it. Copying words, straight for it. When you got Harry Potter going into Chinese, you do a phonetic imitation of Harry Potter, and that solves that problem. Okay, you're bringing it across. When the Russians put up Sputniks, the word Sputnik came into English because the English language didn't have those things. Nowadays, lots of things are borrowed out of English into other languages. Often, this borrowing occurs not because it has to, but because it sounds in some way more prestigious, like when people speak English and throw in a few French words to sound really cool. And I took this one from a newspaper about soccer, about football, that was talking about people in Madrid, and it uses in English the term madrileños are surprisingly unworldly. One supposes that in the context, people will understand that madrileños is a word for people in Madrid. So why not say people in Madrid? Because this sounds cool. It gives a bit of local color, the feel of the thing, okay? So that's copying words. Copying structure is used in cases like this. This is what Julius Caesar said when he went to Gaul, to what's now France, more or less. I came, I saw, I conquered. In the Latin, it's got 3. In English, it's got 3. In Chinese, it's got 3. You retain that structure. You copy the form. But we could talk about copying structure on the level, for example, of what an academic article looks like. The Western model has been imitated in many other languages all over the world, and the same for literary forms. I'm not going to go into that too much. We'll have occasion to talk about it later. Let's get now into the expression change, that long list of things where we change the way we're saying something. I'm talking about perspective change as a category here. It means you've got the one object, but you're seeing it from a different angle. The same object, just a different perspective. And this can mean negation of negation. So nothing is impossible could mean everything is possible. Same thing, you're just saying it from the different perspective, with or without negation. This is important because often when you're stuck, you're really stuck, you don't know how to say this thing. One good trick is to negate it, translate it, and negate that. Negation of the negation will often bring you a solution. Remember this, it'll work, it'll work. Similarly, things like moving the passive to the active or active to the passive. I can say, the door's not open. It can mean, in some respects, please use the other door, or close it, or open it. Sorry, open it, yeah. Those transformations are normal. I like this one, though. 20% off. In English, that's logical for us. 20% off. The reduction is 20%. In Chinese, no, it's discounted to 80%. Same thing, just looking at it a different way. And we have the same thing. I think I prepared most of this for Chinese people, but the examples are illustrative. When you're looking at this island from the perspective of Japan, it's got a Japanese name. And when you're looking at it from the perspective of China, it's got a Chinese name. I think the same thing happens with Everest, which is called Chomolunga on one side. I'm not too sure which side, but depending on where you're looking at it from, the name of the mountain changes. Okay, these are all perspective change. Often when you're stuck, it can work. You think, how can I look at this another way? The glass half full can be the glass half empty. My second major category here is density change. And density here simply means how much information you're giving about a certain referent. But it can also mean how much information is packed into the sentence. So if there's lots of information, you're getting something very granular and you've got high density. If there's not much information, it's like you're looking at it from further away, you can't see so many details, you've got lower density. So sometimes when you've got a problem, the easiest way to solve it is to take a few details out, generalize a little bit, go back from, whoa, I can see the main outline. I don't have to see all the details. And the details, I might make a mistake, but this level is okay. I've got an example here, very specific term. If you've seen bullfighting, there are different movements that the bullfighter can make with the cape, and one of them called is a Veronica, one of them is a Veronica. It's not a girl, it's the movement with the cape. English has no way of translating that. It has no term for it. So often one uses the borrowing. Veronica would come across into the English text, or we could just say the bullfighter's flourish or the movement of the cape. And that would be a generalization, and that solves the problem well enough. We get this going all the time from Chinese into English, where we've just got 4 characters here, which are referring to 3 strictures, 3 sincerities, and people in China supposedly know exactly what that means. Translating into English, it's spelled out what are the 3 guidelines and the 3 rules. It's a campaign to foster ethical integrity among Chinese officials. Thank you. You're taking information that is implicit in the ST, you're making it explicit in the TT. Another example, same thing from Vine Double. You've got St. Mary's, perhaps on the French side or the English side, and in French that's translated as St. Mary's, a private girl for schools. Oh, a private school for girls, I'm sorry. Private school for girls, St. Mary's, okay? It's only 2 words on one side and it becomes an extended phrase on the other, all right? That's so much for that. Resegmentation is important for some language pairs. It's very important between Chinese and English because Chinese can just stack different ideas one after the other and sentences get quite long and there's a very paratactic relation between them. English needs the sentence to be a fixed semantic unit with one predication. So often when you go from Chinese into English, you have to put in sentence breaks. You have to split sentences. And logically, if you were then going from English into Chinese, you might want to join a few sentences together. Not that that's done quite as often. I would also extend this to paragraph organization, since different cultures have different ways of using paragraphs. But here's my favorite example of it. I might have shown it to you before. It's from the Spanish passport. I'll just point out without going through it in detail that the Spanish text there is 1 sentence. The translator into English, if you look at it carefully, has broken it up into 3 sentences because English likes to have simple, clear, straightforward sentences. Well, at least in this case. And the translator got away with it. I think that's very well done. So resegmentation, particularly for some language pairs, okay? What I'm terming cultural correspondence is, I suppose, Eugene Nida's dynamic equivalence. It's the corresponding idioms. It's the equivalence that Vinay and Double-A used. So we've got the example there. Symbolic. I just take this example from a translation, Hong Lu Meng from Chinese into English. One translation done in China is more literal in the title, Dream of the Red Mansion. And Another translation done outside of China by Hawkes and Minford is The Story of the Stone. They got rid of the red, and the argument was that red in Chinese means joy, livelihood, good, yeah, fun, yeah, and red in English means danger, watch out. So the argument was that the symbolics of red does not correspond, and therefore we will replace it with another title. I don't know if that's true. I think translations should be able to communicate different values of different colors in different cultures. However, that's an argument that can be taken up with the translators in this case. From the same novel, we have a place called Brocade Fragrance Court in Chinese, rendered as Budding Grove. Why did they do that? Because this comes from Proust, a French writer, and is a literary allusion that's been added to the text for the sake of greater resonance. People can do that. It makes the text richer, much more engaging in literary terms, and that would be cultural correspondence, suggesting that what's happening in the Chinese novel here was also happening in some way in the Proust's French novel. Our final category is then text tailoring, and quite a few translators would not include this. I think it is something that translators can be called on to do. Whether or not they're doing it as translators is a different thing, but certainly when we get some texts, particularly technical texts, we can be called upon to correct it, okay, when there are things that are false, to update it when necessary, to make it valid information. Think of the COVID-19 information and vaccination information that has to be updated, and the translator can see if it's out of date and alert the client and correct the text if necessary. And you could be editing it or even just creating a summary in some cases, okay? In other cases, you might be called on to add explanatory material. Text tailoring are major changes to the text. They don't happen on the sentence level. Okay, don't confuse this one with all the other ones. This is for the really big things when you got a big pair of scissors and you're changing the ST, not the TT. Okay. Here we have my simple typology. These are the terms in the middle. It's not many to remember. The two kinds of copying, words and structures, perspective and then density, from seeing it from the angle or close up from a long way away, cutting up sentences or joining them together, and then compensation I've got rid of because that was too confusing. I'm sorry about that. Going down to text tailoring. What's interesting here for me is that machine translation will tend not to do the copying because it thinks it's there to translate everything. And traditionally, will not do any text tailoring, will not be very good at cultural correspondence, and will probably not cut up sentences. They'll respect the sentence breaks. So machine translation is sort of operating around the middle there, which is fair enough. That gives a translation. But humans can be called upon to make decisions relating to what we bring into a language or don't, and to the degree to which adaptation is used in our translations. And so it's a way of thinking about the human and the machine in their relationship. When I give these solution types, it's important. The pedagogical aim is to say, when you have a problem, you can think of all these things very quickly. Think of this, think of this, think of this. It does not say there is one solution type for each problem. That's wrong. That will deny the creativity of translation. And I think in theory, but only in theory, for every problem, all solution types are theoretically possible, although many of them become absurd. That's a theory. Often you can combine solution types. Okay, so for example, here's an example from Newmark. You've got an administrative unit in German called a Gemeinde. A Gemeinde is like a municipality, I suppose, but it's not quite the same thing. So what you do in English, you reproduce the German term, so that's borrowing, you bring it across, and then you say an administrative unit smaller than a municipality. Okay, and you give an explanation. So you've got loan plus explicitation. And you can combine all these solution types until you get something that works. However, when you're working professionally, you might want to privilege the solution types that require least effort. So if you can get away with a loan word, that's much easier. Requires less effort than putting in a full explanation. Okay. And some solution types at the same time incur a higher risk of error, a higher risk of misleading people. And this is interesting when you consider things like adding explanations. When you do that, you have to be sure that your reading of the text is correct. Every explanation you add is quite risky. So often, to avoid that risk, people will go for something more literal. Not because it's necessarily helping the reader. No, it's just saving the translator from making a mistake. Okay, so when deciding between which solution to use, for me personally, I think that decision depends on how much effort you want to expend, whether or not it's worth it or not, and the risk of error, the risk of misleading the reader. Those are the two criteria. So it means that you choose your solution according to how much you like working, yeah, and how risk averse you are or risk taking. Okay. Now that's it. That's the presentation of the types. When we get into class, we're going to go back to the way you translated those terms. So you know what? If you forgot to translate them at the beginning of this lecture, now is a really good time for you to go through and translate the terms. We'll see you in class.